She wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody was not at 2 in the morning. Not in the presidential suite on the 31st floor of the most expensive hotel in Chicago, and certainly not a 27-year-old cleaning lady with $43 in her bank account and bleach stains on her uniform. But Cora Langley hadn't slept in 30 hours. Her 6-year-old niece needed ear medication they couldn't afford. Her shoes were worn down to nothing, and she'd picked up a double shift because the alternative was choosing between the electric bill and the prescription, and she was tired of choosing. So when she rolled her cleaning cart into Suite 3100 for the routine Friday turndown, and the Egyptian cotton sheets felt softer than anything she'd ever touched in her life, she told herself 1 minute, just 1 minute to close her eyes. She didn't get 1 minute. She got 3 hours. And when she opened her eyes, there was a man standing at the foot of the bed. He wasn't calling security. He wasn't reaching for the phone on the nightstand. He was just standing there, tie loosened, suit jacket draped over his arm, a glass of whiskey still in his hand, watching her with the calm, unblinking patience of someone who'd already decided she wasn't a threat, but hadn't yet decided what she was. His name was Beckett Crane. They called him the Architect, not because he built buildings, though he owned enough of them, but because he built systems that made powerful men disappear without a sound. He ran the kind of empire that doesn't show up on Forbes lists, the kind where people use words like organization and family and mean something the rest of the world pretends doesn't exist. He had 2 7-year-old twin daughters sleeping at his private estate blocks away, a dead wife whose car accident wasn't an accident, and a reputation so precise that the hotel staff had never once seen his face. They just knew the suite was always ready, and the questions were never asked. And right now, this man who could end a problem with a single phone call, was looking at a sleeping cleaning lady in his bed. And for a reason he didn't understand and wouldn't examine for weeks, he said 5 words that changed everything. Leave when you're ready. Drop a like if you're already hooked. Share this with someone who needs a story tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that elevator, 3 hours earlier, where Cora Langley was about to make the most dangerous mistake of her life. 3 hours earlier, the service elevator of the Kensington Grand Hotel was carrying Cora Langley up to the 31st floor. This elevator wasn't like the elevators for guests. It had no mirrors, no music, no faint perfume drifting from the fresh flower arrangements changed every morning in the main lobby. The service elevator smelled of industrial cleaner, of rubber from the wheels of housekeeping carts, and of slightly flickering fluorescent light that no one bothered to fix because no one important ever took this elevator. Cora leaned her back against the steel wall, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then forced them open. Her dark blue uniform was still damp at the cuffs because, during the previous shift, she'd cleaned a flooded bathroom on the 12th floor, and the sneakers she wore had grown so thin that she could feel every raised line on the elevator floor through the soles of her feet. This was her second night shift in a row. The first shift was hers. The second one she'd taken for a coworker named Greta, who had the flu and called in sick at 4 in the afternoon. Cora couldn't say no, because every extra shift meant $87 before taxes, and that morning she'd just spent 2.5 hours sitting in a pediatric clinic on West Madison Street with Dot. Dot sat on her lap, her face flushed, one hand clutching Cora's shirt, the other covering her right ear because it hurt. Middle ear infection, the doctor said, writing a prescription for antibiotics. And when Cora asked about payment, the woman at the reception desk looked at the screen, then looked back at her with the kind of look Cora knew too well, the kind of look people had just before they said a number that would hurt. Dot's insurance was through Medicaid, but the antibiotic the doctor prescribed wasn't on the covered list, and the alternative would need 3 to 5 business days for approval. Dot was crying from pain. Cora paid cash. $43 was what she had left, after she walked out of the pharmacy with the little bottle of antibiotics in a white plastic bag, and Dot had stopped crying because the first dose was beginning to work. $43, and the electric bill was due Monday. Cora didn't think about that now. She thought about the elevator stopping, the doors opening, and the hallway on the 31st floor stretching out before her, long and golden, and so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner behind the wall. This hallway was different from every other floor in the hotel. The carpet was thicker, the lighting warmer, and there were only 4 doors instead of 20. The last door on the right had no room number on the outside, only a small brass plaque engraved with 2 words, Presidential Suite. Every employee in the hotel knew about this room. It was kept permanently reserved for the man who owned the hotel. No one on the housekeeping crew had ever met the owner. No one knew what he looked like. The only thing they knew was that the room was cleaned on Tuesdays and Fridays, whether anyone was staying there or not. The towels replaced, the sheets changed, the minibar checked, and no one ever asked any questions. Cora pushed the housekeeping cart down the hallway, swiped her employee card over the reader, watched the green light blink, and opened the door. Inside, everything was completely dark. Heavy velvet curtains covered the windows, blocking out every glimmer of the city lights. She stepped in, and the scent of the room reached her before her eyes could adjust. Oak, leather, and something more refined she couldn't name. Perhaps the smell of money when it didn't have to try. She turned on a side lamp in the corner, bright enough to work by, but not bright enough to break the heavy warm darkness lying over everything. She began cleaning according to procedure. The bathroom first, then the minibar, then the bed linens. But at the third step, when she pulled off the old sheet and spread the new one across the mattress, her hand touched the fabric and stopped. She'd never touched anything so soft. Not soft in the ordinary way, but soft in a way that made her body, the body that had stood for 14 hours, had held Dot in the clinic, had cleaned a flooded bathroom, had pushed a cart across 17 floors, suddenly understand how tired it truly was. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Just for 1 second, her back met the mattress, and she felt the full weight of 30 sleepless hours collapse all at once, as if someone had finally flipped off the switch that had been keeping her upright. She lay down. Her shoes were still on. The cleaning rag was still clenched in her right hand. Just 1 minute, she thought. Just 1 minute. Then she'd get up, finish the room, push the cart down to the 28th floor, do the last 3 rooms before 5 in the morning, then go home, then check Dot's ear, then figure out how $43 could be divided between the electric bill and food for the next week. And then. The thought never ended. Her eyes closed, and Cora Langley vanished into the deepest sleep she'd had in months. On a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that wasn't hers, on the highest floor of a hotel. She was only allowed to enter when she was holding a cleaning rag. Cora didn't move for 2 seconds after he said that sentence. Her brain was still processing, still trying to fit the pieces together. Where she was, why there was a man at the foot of the bed, why he wasn't shouting, why he wasn't calling anyone. Then he turned his back, walked toward the table by the window, and set the glass of whiskey down on the glass surface with a soft sound, just loud enough to hear. "How long?" he said, his back still turned to her. His voice didn't rise higher than necessary, and there was no urgency in it, as if the question was something he asked out of curiosity, not because he was calculating anything. How long what? Cora heard her own voice, hoarse and small, the voice of someone who had just been sleeping deeply and then been pulled to the surface too quickly. "How long had you been awake before you fell asleep in my bed?" He took off his watch, placed it beside the whiskey glass, still not turning around. The motion was slow, exact, the kind of motion that belonged to a man who did everything in order without needing to think, because order had already settled into his bones. "Nearly 30 hours, Cora said, and she felt that answer was both the truth and a defense, and she hated that she was defending herself to a stranger for being too tired. He gave a slight nod, a nod she almost couldn't see because the room was still dark, and he was standing in shadow. Ago. He said nothing else. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask how long she'd worked here, didn't ask why 30 hours. That silence was stranger than any question, because it wasn't the silence of someone who didn't care. It was the silence of someone who had already gathered enough answers just by looking. Cora set her feet on the floor, stood up, and her body protested every movement. She bent down to pick up the cleaning rag that had slipped from her hand at some point during the past 3 hours. It lay on the carpet beside the bed, white and crumpled, looking pitiful under the dim side lamp. She dropped the rag into the cart, checked quickly, and everything was still in its place. The glass cleaner, the roll of trash bags, the stack of towels she hadn't had time to replace. The room wasn't finished. She knew that, and he knew it too, but neither of them mentioned it, because the sheets were wrinkled in the shape of her body, and mentioning that the room wasn't finished would mean mentioning that she had lain there long enough to leave a mark on the fabric, and both of them chose not to step into that place. Cora pushed the cart toward the door. As she passed him, about 1 meter away, she felt something she didn't have the exact word to name, a kind of density, as if the air around this man was thicker than normal, heavier, with its own gravity. She didn't look over. She looked straight at the room door, her hands pushing the cart, her back straight, her steps even, and she knew he was watching her leave because she could feel his gaze on the back of her neck like heat. She opened the door, pushed the cart out into the hallway, and nearly ran into a man standing right outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit, his arms folded across his chest, and he had clearly been standing there the entire time she was inside the room. Maybe even longer. Cora had never seen him before. He didn't belong to the hotel's security team. She knew every night shift guard. He belonged to the man in that room. She understood that instantly. The way you understand certain things without anyone explaining them. The way you look at a closed door and know you shouldn't open it. The man looked at her, said nothing, didn't block her way, didn't step aside. He simply looked, and that stare said more than any sentence he could have spoken. It said she shouldn't be here, that this hallway, this floor, that room, weren't places meant for her, that people who stepped out of that door at 2 o'clock in the morning usually weren't pushing housekeeping carts, and that he was wondering, truly wondering, why she was walking out instead of not walking out at all. Cora pushed the cart past him. She didn't speed up, didn't slow down, keeping the steady pace of someone doing her job and moving in the direction she needed to go. She didn't run. Running would be admitting there was something to run from, and Cora had learned long ago that running only made you look like prey. The cart wheels rattled softly over the thick carpet, the only sound in the hallway. She pressed the elevator button, waited, and didn't look back, even though she knew the man in the black suit was still standing there, still watching, still saying nothing. The elevator doors opened. She pushed the cart inside. The doors closed. And when she was finally alone, inside that small steel box, with the flickering fluorescent light and the familiar smell of cleaner, Cora leaned her back against the elevator wall and realized her hands were shaking, not from fear. She'd been afraid of many things in her life. Afraid of bills, afraid of losing Dot, afraid Hugh Prescott would find her, and she knew what fear felt like. This wasn't fear. This was something else, something it took her a moment to recognize. Standing in the elevator at 2:15 in the morning, with a cleaning rag on the cart and worn shoes on the steel floor. 5 words, leave when you're ready. He hadn't said, get out of here. He hadn't said, I'll call the manager. He hadn't said, do you know where you are? He had said, when you're ready, as if her time mattered, as if she had the right to choose when she left, as if the fact that she had slept in his bed was something that could be handled with patience instead of anger. Cora couldn't remember the last time anyone had given her the right to choose anything. She chose between the electric bill and medicine. She chose between the night shift and sleep. She chose between running and dying. But no one had ever said to her, when you're ready, as if her readiness was something worth waiting for. Her hands were shaking because of that. Because 5 words from a stranger in a dark room had touched something she'd kept locked away for a very long time. Something so simple and small that it shouldn't have had this much power. But it did. The elevator reached the basement. The doors opened. Cora wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, pushed the cart out, and went to clean the remaining 3 rooms before 5 o'clock in the morning, because no matter what had just happened on the 31st floor, she still had $43 in her account, and Dot still needed breakfast. And the world didn't stop just because someone had been kind to her in the dark. Cora finished cleaning the remaining 3 rooms before 5 o'clock in the morning, signed the shift handover log, changed out of her uniform in the basement staff room, and sat on the white plastic chair in front of locker number 14 for 15 full minutes, staring at her phone screen without reading anything. She called Polly at 5:30 to ask her to pick Dot up from home before Dot woke, because Cora knew she wouldn't make it back in time. Polly didn't ask why. Polly understood that not making it back in time was the everyday language of people who worked 2 shifts in a row. Cora washed her face in the staff restroom, looked at herself in the mirror, dark circles under her eyes, dull hair, skin pale from lack of sleep, and thought she looked exactly like what she was, a person trying not to sink. 7 o'clock in the morning. Cora was sitting in the basement staff break area, drinking machine coffee from a paper cup, when Phil appeared in the doorway. Phil Nauman, the housekeeping manager, 52 years old, was the kind of man born to be middle management, afraid enough of his superiors to never object, kind enough to his subordinates to never be cruel, and always breaking into a sweat across his forehead whenever he had to say anything more important than the shift schedule. Phil's forehead was soaked with sweat now. Langley, he said, and his voice had the strained quality of a man trying to stay calm and not quite succeeding. Come into my office for a minute. Cora followed him down the narrow hallway behind the laundry area and into the small room. Phil called his office, though it was really just a square with a desk, a computer, a whiteboard showing the shift schedule, and the list of rooms that needed priority. Phil closed the door, and the fact that he closed it told Cora more than anything he was about to say, because Phil never closed the door unless someone was about to get fired or someone was about to hear news too large for an open door to hold. He sat down in his chair, dabbed a paper towel against his forehead, then looked at her with the expression of a man who didn't know where to begin, so he decided to begin in the middle. "The presidential suite," Phil said. "Last night." Cora didn't react. She'd been preparing for this sentence since the moment she stepped out of the elevator. She'd prepared to be fired, prepared to lose $87 per shift, prepared to call Polly and say, "I need to borrow money for the electric bill," prepared for every consequence that falling asleep in the owner's bed would bring. She wasn't prepared for what Phil said next. "Do you know who that room is for?" "Beckett Crane." Phil blinked. He clearly hadn't expected her to know that name, because most employees didn't. The owner of the Kensington Grand Hotel wasn't someone who appeared at industry events, didn't land on magazine covers, didn't have a Wikipedia page 30 paragraphs long. Beckett Crane paid not to appear, and when you have enough money, invisibility becomes a luxury more expensive than any watch. But Cora knew that name. She didn't know it from the press, or staff gossip, or Google. She knew it from 2 years spent sitting in the office of Prescott and Associates, on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop, Chicago, where she'd worked as a forensic accountant for Hugh Prescott, a man who wore gray suits, smiled broadly, and ran a company that specialized in helping certain streams of money look cleaner than they truly were. The Crane name didn't appear on official paperwork. The Crane name was buried in deeper layers, in transaction lists Cora was never supposed to see, in shell companies she'd accidentally traced while auditing a chain of unusual payments for a client. No one in the firm would call by name. She remembered the afternoon she opened that file. She remembered the numbers, remembered the way they lined up neatly on the surface, while underneath was a maze, money entering from one side, disappearing through 3 or 4 layers of ghost companies, then appearing on the other side as clean as if it had never touched mud. She remembered bringing that discovery to Hugh Prescott. She remembered Hugh's eyes when he looked at her across his desk, still smiling, though the smile no longer reached his eyes, and said, "Don't look there, Cora. Some things aren't our business." She didn't listen. Not long after, her brother died in a car crash the police called an accident, and Cora called a message. Following that tragedy, she found herself mopping hotel floors at 2 o'clock in the morning under her mother's name, trying to disappear. And now Phil was sitting in front of her, telling her that the man who owned the presidential suite, the man who had stood at the foot of the bed watching her sleep, the man who had said, "When you're ready," in that calm voice at 2 o'clock in the morning, was Beckett Crane. The name from the file. The financial maze. The indirect reason. Through Hugh Prescott. Through those money trails. Through a chain of events no one would ever call cause and effect but Cora knew were connected. That her life had collapsed. She'd slept in that man's bed. And that man had let her leave. "He isn't angry," Phil said, and his voice carried a faint amazement, as if even Phil didn't understand it. "At least from what I was told, he isn't angry. But he wants to see you." Cora looked at Phil. "Why?" Phil dabbed his forehead again, folded the paper towel, looked down at the desk, then looked up, and spoke with the honesty of a man who had been earning wages long enough to know that some questions were better left unasked. "I didn't ask, Langley. People don't ask Mr. Crane why." Cora sat still for another 3 seconds. She thought about $43. She thought about Dot sleeping at Polly's house. She thought about the Crane name in the file she never should have opened, and her brother who never should have died, and herself, who never should have been sitting here in a janitor's uniform with the smell of cleaner under her fingernails. Then she stood up, because when you have $43 and someone wants to see you, you don't have the luxury of saying no. The restaurant at the Kensington Grand Hotel at 7:30 in the morning was almost empty. A few business travelers sat, scattered around, their eyes fixed on laptops or phones, drinking coffee with the numb concentration of people who had an 8 o'clock meeting they still hadn't finished preparing for. Morning light poured in through the large east-facing windows and spread across the marble floor, and soft jazz played somewhere in the background, though no one was really listening. Cora saw him the moment she stepped through the door. The last corner table on the right, beside the window, his back to the wall, his face angled toward the entire restaurant. It wasn't a seat chosen for the view. It was a seat chosen because, From there, he could see every entrance and exit, and no one could come at him from behind. Beckett Crane sat there with a cup of coffee in front of him. One cup. He hadn't bought one for her. No courtesy, no pretense that this was an equal meeting between two people sharing coffee. He was reading something on his phone when she approached, and he didn't look up right away. He let her stand there for exactly 3 seconds before he placed the phone face down on the table and looked at her. Cora understood that it was intentional. Those 3 seconds weren't because he was busy. Those 3 seconds were there to let her know that time in this conversation would move according to his rhythm. She recognized Knox, too. The man in the black suit from the hallway on the 31st floor last night was sitting 3 tables away, the New York Times open in front of him, and though his posture perfectly matched that of a business guest reading the morning news, Cora noticed that the page hadn't turned once since she entered. She sat down across from Beckett because she didn't see any other choice, and she was painfully aware that she was sitting in this restaurant in a janitor's uniform, her hair tied up with an elastic band, no makeup on her face, the smell of cleaner still faint beneath her fingernails, facing a man in a charcoal gray shirt with no tie, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, the watch on his wrist looking like something that could pay her apartment rent for 5 years. He looked at her for about 2 seconds without saying anything. Then he began, and he began in a way Cora would later recognize as the way he always began everything, without circling, without leading her toward it, without giving her time to prepare. Cora Langley, 27 years old, night shift janitor at the Kensington Grand, 4 months. Before that, he paused, not for drama, but because he was choosing the word blank. No employment record, no LinkedIn account, no digital footprint of any kind, as if you didn't exist before August. Cora kept her face calm. She'd practiced this. 2 years at Prescott and Associates had taught her how to sit still when someone said something that made her heart beat twice as fast. But under the table, her hands clenched in her lap, Beckett took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and continued as if he were reading from a file he had already memorized. Cora Ellsworth, University of Illinois graduate, forensic accounting major, worked at Prescott and Associates for 2 years, specialized in cash flow analysis and auditing complex transaction records, highly rated by both supervisors and clients. Then, he looked at her, disappeared. Cora didn't move. Her body was doing what she had trained it to do in danger, completely still, completely quiet, because running or reacting would be an admission that he was right, and she wasn't ready to admit anything. "You changed to your mother's last name," he said. "Langley. Moved to the South Side. Took work that didn't require a deep background check. You're very good at becoming invisible, but you made one mistake." "What mistake?" She heard her own voice, and was surprised by how steady it sounded. "You're too good." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it as if he were presenting evidence. "The rooms you clean are cleaner than any other rooms in this hotel. Guest ratings for the floors you're assigned to have increased 17% in 4 months. Management noticed. I noticed." He leaned forward slightly. "People in hiding usually do just enough not to be noticed. You don't know how to do that. You do the best you can at anything you touch, even mopping floors. That's the habit of someone properly trained, not someone merely trying to get through the day." Cora didn't answer. She was calculating. He knew her real name. He knew about Prescott. He might know about her brother, about Dot, about everything. The question wasn't how much he knew, but what he intended to do with what he knew. "I don't care what you're hiding from," Beckett said, and she believed him. Not because he was trustworthy, but because his voice carried the quality of cold truth, the kind of truth that didn't need her belief because it was true whether she accepted it or not. "I care that you know how to read numbers. And based on the reason you had to run, you read them very well." Silence. The jazz kept playing in the background. Knox didn't turn the page of the newspaper. "I need someone to audit the bookkeeping systems of 3 real estate companies under Crane Holdings," he said. The last person who did this left. The way he said left was completely flat, with no emphasis, no explanation. And because of that, Cora understood that left didn't mean someone had handed in a resignation letter and collected a year-end bonus. 11-week contract, paid weekly. He said the number. Cora didn't change her expression, but beneath the table, her hands tightened so hard her nails dug into her palms. That number equaled 2 years of janitor wages. More than 2 years, if she did the math. Enough to pay the electric bill, buy better insurance for Dot, buy new shoes for both of them, and still have enough left for her to stop waking up every morning with the equation of $43 divided by life. "Why me?" she asked. And she asked because she needed him to say out loud what she was already thinking. She needed to hear it in his voice instead of the voice inside her head. "Because you looked at Hugh Prescott's books and saw what his entire 6-person audit team either didn't see or didn't dare see." He pushed his coffee cup aside. "I don't need someone brave. I need someone with eyes." He stood, buttoned his cuffs, and looked at her one last time before leaving. "You have until Monday to decide. My assistant, Odette Shaw, will be in touch." He walked away, and Knox folded the unread newspaper, rose after him, and the two men disappeared from the restaurant with the kind of stride Cora recognized as belonging to people used to leaving a place before the place had time to remember they had ever been there. Cora remained at the table alone. His coffee cup was still on the table, faint steam rising from it. She looked at it, then looked out the window, then looked down at her hands, still clenched in her lap, nail marks pressed into her palms. She thought about Dot, about the bottle of antibiotics in the refrigerator at home, slowly emptying, about Dot's shoes, the toes coming apart at the seams, and how Cora had glued them back together twice with shoe glue, but the third time, the glue wouldn't hold anymore. About the $43 that tomorrow would become less than $43, because Dot needed food, and the lights needed to stay on, and life didn't come with a pause button for poor people. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about this. She was about to accept work from the man whose name sat inside the transaction file that had destroyed her life. He hadn't killed her brother. He might not even know her brother had existed, but his money had moved through the system Hugh Prescott operated, and that system had crushed her when she tried to shine a light into it. And now he was inviting her back into that exact world, not because he was kind, but because he needed her eyes. Cora knew she should say no. She knew it with the part of her reason that was still functioning after 30 hours awake. But reason didn't pay for medicine. And when you have $43 and the child you're raising has an earache and needs new shoes, you don't choose between right and wrong. You choose between surviving and not surviving. And you call it a decision because calling it being cornered hurts too much. On the first Monday, Cora arrived at the Crane Holdings building at 7:53 in the morning. The building stood in downtown Chicago, on South Wacker Drive. 42 stories of glass reflecting the city's silver-gray sky like a giant mirror that didn't bother telling you what was inside. The ground floor lobby was all white marble and steel, with hidden lights in the ceiling casting an even but cold glow, the kind of lighting designed to make everything look precise and sharp and slightly unreal. Cora wore the only outfit she owned that wasn't a janitor's uniform: black pants, a white shirt she'd bought at Target for $3 on clearance, and the shoes she had polished the night before, though the polish couldn't hide the peeling leather at the heels. She kept her back straight as she crossed the lobby because she'd learned that posture could stand in for a wardrobe if you believed in your shoulders hard enough. The elevator carried her up to the 38th floor. The doors opened, and she stepped into a space where everything was angular, glass, steel, and straight lines intersecting with such precision that it seemed the designer believed curves were a sign of weakness. The view from the 38th floor looked out across Chicago, wide enough to see Lake Michigan to the east, and the skyline stretching until the city ran out of patience and gave way to the suburbs. Cora didn't stop to admire it. She'd lived in Chicago long enough to know that beautiful views from high floors were something rich people used to remind everyone else of distance. Odette Shaw met her at reception, 45 years old, prematurely silver hair twisted into a neat bun, dressed entirely in black from blazer to shoes, and carrying herself with the posture of a woman who occupied space not through size, but through the absolute certainty that she belonged here, and you probably didn't. Odette looked Cora over from head to toe, making no effort to hide the fact that she was assessing her, not pretending at politeness, only measuring her with the cold efficiency of someone who had assessed many people before Cora, most of whom hadn't passed. "Mr. Crane says you're good at reading numbers," Odette said. Her voice wasn't warm or cold, just flat. The voice of someone who saved emotion for things that actually deserved it. "I'll see for myself." She led Cora to a small office in the corner of the floor, with a desk, a computer, a glass wall looking out at the city but not at the lake, because the lake was reserved for offices more important than this one. On the desk sat a stack of files, 3 external hard drives, and a handwritten sheet with the system login password. Odette offered no further explanation. She placed Cora's employee badge on the desk, said, "Meetings with Mr. Crane on Tuesdays and Thursdays. 9 o'clock in the morning. Conference room 23. then walked out and closed the door, leaving Cora alone with Beckett Crane's 3 real estate companies and the silence of the 38th floor. Cora opened the first file at 8:15. By 10 o'clock, she had forgotten she was inside the building of a dangerous man. Her mind had shifted into the mode it always entered when she worked with numbers, the mode where everything else vanished and only patterns remained, data streams, numbers telling stories to someone who knew how to listen. 3 companies, Crane Realty Partners, Lakeshore Development Group, and Wacker Capital, were, on paper, 3 legitimate real estate entities, buying and selling buildings, developing projects, leasing commercial spaces. The books were clean. Every annual audit had passed. Taxes were paid on time. Everything lined up, tidy, orderly, according to procedure. But Cora hadn't been hired to look at what lined up. She'd been hired because she knew how to look at the spaces between the rows. During the first week, she found 3 empty spaces. Recurring monthly payments to a contractor named Ridgeline Construction. Stable amounts. Complete invoices. But when Cora looked up Ridgeline in the Illinois State Business Registry, the company had no employees, no physical address except a post office box in Schaumburg, and a business license that renewed automatically each year, with no real activity attached to it. She had seen this pattern before. This exact pattern. At Prescott and Associates, on the computer screen on the 14th floor, on the afternoon when she should have closed the file and gone home. During the second week, she found 5 more empty spaces. Outgoing funds from Lakeshore Development for consulting services, from 3 different companies, all with the same signer, all registered in different states, but sharing the same fax number. Money flowed out, services didn't exist, and someone inside Crane Holdings had built a very neat pipeline to siphon money away while the books stayed clean on the surface. Cora took notes. She marked things. She took screenshots, saved them in a separate folder on her personal hard drive, and stayed quiet. Because the last time she saw this pattern and opened her mouth, her brother went to work on a Wednesday morning and never came home. The first Tuesday meeting with Beckett lasted 90 minutes. He asked about her progress, and she reported the surface findings, the structure of the 3 companies, the accounting system, the previous audit procedures. He listened, asked 2 short questions, both so precise that Cora understood he wasn't asking to learn. He was asking to see how she would answer. The Thursday meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end of the second week, the Tuesday and Thursday meetings regularly stretched to 3 hours, and Cora realized that most of the extra time wasn't because there was more material, but because of the way Beckett asked questions. He asked 1 question. She answered, and the answer led to the next question she hadn't seen coming. And that question led to 15 minutes of her digging into a detail she had thought was small, only to realize it wasn't small at all. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at his watch. He listened with a kind of focus Cora had never encountered in any client or boss before. The focus of someone who was truly processing every word she said instead of waiting for her to finish so he could say his part. On Wednesday morning of the second week, Cora arrived at her desk and found a cup of coffee already there. Black, no sugar. She hadn't told anyone in this building how she took her coffee. She looked at the cup, looked around the room, and saw no one. She took a sip. The temperature was right. From then on, every morning she came in, the cup of coffee was already on the desk. Black, no sugar, the right temperature. She didn't ask who put it there. She didn't know whether it was Odette or someone else. But someone had watched her closely enough during the first week to know what she drank without needing her to say it, and that made her feel seen, while also reminding her that in this place, everyone was watching everyone, including her. At the end of the third week, Cora sat in her small office at 7 o'clock in the evening, everyone else on the 38th floor already gone, and stared at the computer screen with 11 irregularities highlighted in red across the spreadsheet. 11 holes. 11 pipelines leading money out of Crane Holdings into companies that didn't exist. Someone inside Beckett Crane's organization was stealing from him, and doing it with the sophistication of a person who understood the system from the inside. Someone with access, with approval, authority, with enough knowledge to bury the trail just deep enough that ordinary audits wouldn't see it, but not deep enough to escape the eyes of someone who had seen this exact trick before. Cora looked at the 11 red marks on the screen. She thought about her brother. She thought about that Wednesday morning when he didn't come home. She thought about Hugh Prescott saying, "Don't look there." Then she turned off the screen, closed her laptop, took her purse, and went home to make noodles for Dot. because she needed time to decide, and she had learned that the most important decisions should be made after you've eaten dinner, after the child you're raising has fallen asleep, and after the apartment is quiet enough for you to hear your own thoughts, without the noise of fear drowning them out. Cora met Beckett's daughters on a Tuesday afternoon during the 4th week, and she wasn't prepared for it at all. She was sitting in conference room 23, waiting for Beckett to arrive for the 9 o'clock meeting that had been moved to 3 o'clock in the afternoon because he had business outside the city. Her laptop open, 3 spreadsheets running side by side, the 11 red marks in her mind still blinking like warning lights. She hadn't yet decided whether to turn into an alarm when the conference room door opened and 2 children walked in. They didn't walk in as if they were lost, or shy, or looking around for an adult. They walked in like 2 people familiar with this building, who knew exactly where conference room 23 was, who knew how to press the elevator button for the 38th floor, who knew this was their father's territory, and therefore theirs too. The first child to enter had black curly hair cut to her shoulders, wore a purple sweater with old acrylic paint stains on the cuffs, the kind that had clearly been washed many times but still refused to leave, carried a backpack too large for her small body, and had a thick book about astronomy tucked under one arm, its cover worn at the corners from being opened too often. She didn't look at Cora. She walked straight to the chair at the end of the conference table, sat down, dropped the backpack to the floor with a familiar thud, opened the book, and began reading as if Cora were a piece of furniture that had already been there. The second child walked in right after her. And if the first one was silence, the second one was the perfect opposite. Her hair was the same black but worn loose. Her red sneakers looked newer than everything else on her, and she looked directly at Cora with the plain, unadorned stare children use before they've learned the art of pretending not to be curious. "Who are you?" she asked. No greeting, no introduction. Just the question, clean and straight. "I'm Cora. I work with your father." The child in the red sneakers tilted her head to the right, assessing the answer with a seriousness wildly out of proportion to her 7-year-old face. "Dad says you're good at finding out when people lie about money." Cora blinked. From the end of the conference table, the child in the purple sweater still didn't look up from the astronomy book, but said, her voice calm, as if she were reading a footnote, "Dad doesn't say that about everyone. Dad only says that when he's impressed." Cora looked at the child in the purple sweater, then at the child in the red sneakers, then realized she was sitting in front of Beckett Crane's twin daughters with no briefing whatsoever. And she didn't know their names, didn't know which one was which, and didn't know why Beckett was telling 2 7-year-old girls that she was good at detecting when people lied about money. "I'm Nell," the child in the red sneakers said, then pointed toward the end of the table. "That's B. B doesn't talk much to new people, but if B didn't like you, she'd have left already. So the fact that B is sitting here is good." B turned a page without looking up. "Correct," she said, a brief confirmation. Nell pulled a chair closer to Cora, set her elbows on the table, and her eyes stopped on something on Cora's work table. The snow globe. Small, cheap, bought from a souvenir shop on Michigan Avenue for $5, with a miniature Chicago skyline inside and fake snow that, when shaken, swirled up and then settled in clumps at the bottom. Dot had slipped it into Cora's coat pocket. On the first morning Cora went to work at Crane Holdings, and when Cora asked why, Dot had said, "So you won't be lonely?" in a completely serious 6-year-old voice, and Cora had carried it with her every day since, placing it on her desk like some small useless charm she couldn't give up. "Whose is this?" Nell asked, picking up the snow globe, shaking it, watching the snow fall. "My niece's, Dot. She's 6. "Niece?" Nell shook it again, the snow spinning. "You're raising your niece? Why?" The question wasn't cruel. Children ask why by instinct, not because they're prying, but because they haven't yet learned that some answers are heavier than the question. "Because her father isn't here anymore," Cora said. She said it softly, keeping her voice even, the way she always spoke when mentioning her brother. Because if she let emotion into it, it would be too much for a conference room at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Her father was my brother. He died, and Dot's mother was gone before that, so I'm raising her." Nell stopped shaking the snow globe. She looked at Cora, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Nell was silent. The kind of silence of a child processing something familiar in an unexpected way. From the end of the table, B looked up. For the first time, B looked straight at Cora, and her eyes were so much like Beckett's that Cora nearly forgot to breathe. The same direct gaze, unblinking, unflinching, looking at something and seeing it completely. "Our mother isn't here anymore either," B said. Her voice wasn't sad. It was flat, factual. The voice of a child who had lived with this truth long enough for it to become part of the furniture in her mind. Still there, but no longer something she bumped into every day. The three of them looked at one another. Cora, B, Nell. Conference room 23, on the 38th floor, between spreadsheets and ledgers and 11 red marks. And something shifted among the three of them. Light, soundless, like a tectonic plate moving underground so slowly that the surface didn't crack. But you knew it had changed. Nell placed the snow globe back on the table carefully, with both hands. "Dot sounds nice," she said quietly. Then she turned to B. "Show Cora the book." B looked at Nell, then at Cora. Then, with the deliberate slowness of a child deciding whether to trust someone, she pushed the astronomy book across the tabletop toward Cora, open to the page she had folded at the corner. "This page," B said. Cora looked down. The page was about dead stars. Stars that had gone out millions of years ago, but whose light was still traveling toward Earth, still bright in the night sky, still seen by people standing below and looking up, not knowing that what they were seeing no longer existed. "Dad says people are like that too," B said, her voice small but clear. "Some people aren't here anymore, but what they left behind still shines. It still reaches us." Cora looked at this 7-year-old girl in a purple sweater stained with paint, with a book worn at the corners and Beckett Crane's eyes, and she thought, "You're going to be terrifying when you grow up." And she also thought, "You're talking about your mother," and those two thoughts lived together in her chest without contradicting each other. "That's a beautiful truth," Cora said. "It's science," B corrected. "Science is more beautiful because it's real." Nell looked at Cora with a testing expression, the kind of test children give when they're waiting to see whether you respond correctly. Cora had apparently responded correctly, because Nell gave a small nod, turned to her backpack, pulled out a box of crayons, spread paper across the conference table, and began drawing as if this were her personal office, and Cora were an invited guest. 2 hours later, when Beckett stepped into conference room 23 at 5:30, he stopped in the doorway. B was sitting cross-legged on her chair, the astronomy book open in her lap, leaning toward Cora, who was pointing at a photograph of a nebula and explaining something Cora didn't really understand, but was listening to with the full attention the child deserved. Nell was lying on the floor beneath the conference table, drawing paper all around her, crayons scattered everywhere, coloring a night sky full of stars, most of which weren't round, but were very certain. Cora looked up when she heard the footsteps stop and caught Beckett in the doorway. He didn't step in right away. He stood there, and his face did something Cora almost missed, because it was quick and slight, and clearly something he hadn't meant for anyone to see. His face went quiet, not sad, not happy, something in between that Cora would later learn to recognize. The thing that happens to the face of a person who is looking at something they're afraid they want. Afraid because wanting means it can be lost, and they've already lost enough. "Dad," Nell rolled out from under the table. "Cora has a niece named Dot. You should meet Dot." Beckett looked at Nell, then at B, still sitting in her chair with the book as if no one had arrived, then at Cora. Cora looked away. Too late. She had already seen his face in the doorway, and she knew what it was, because she recognized it from the inside, from the deepest place she tried to keep sealed, where something was beginning to shift that she wasn't ready to name. Week 5 began with trouble Cora had smelled since the week before but hadn't yet been able to name. Warren Fisk, the chief financial officer of Crane Holdings, 42 years old, neatly cut hair, suits always pressed flat, was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth while his eyes were calculating, and he began delaying the documents Cora requested. The first time was a polite email. "The file is being updated. I'll send it later." The second time was a call from Warren's assistant saying the Lakeshore development records needed internal approval before being transferred to audit. The third time, Warren came by her office himself, knocked without waiting for an answer, sat down in the chair across from her with a perfectly friendly smile, and said he thought Cora should focus on Wacker Capital first, because it would be easier for someone new, and maybe Lakeshore should be set aside for the time being. Cora understood. She understood because she had seen this exact thing at Prescott, the kind of person who began building walls around what he wanted hidden when someone dug too close. She didn't argue with Warren. She said, "All right, I'll review Wacker Capital again." And when he left the room, she wrote Warren Fisk's name in her personal notebook, underlined it twice, and knew that the 11 red marks on her screen had just gained a face. She told Beckett during the Thursday meeting, not about the 11 red marks, not yet, but about the blocked documents. He was silent for about 5 seconds, then said, "I have the original documents at home, not at the office. I don't trust leaving them at the office." Then he said she should visit his penthouse that weekend to look at them in person. The taxi ride from her apartment took 40 minutes, paid with her own cash, because she refused to let Odette arrange a corporate car, as Cora wasn't ready for anyone in this organization to pay for anything beyond her contract wages. Beckett's penthouse was in the Gold Coast neighborhood, in an old pre-war building, its red brick exterior and clean windows looking unshowy from the street. The doorman knew her name before she could say it, and led her into the private elevator without asking. She had prepared herself for something cold, glass and steel, like the office on the 38th floor. A space designed to impress rather than to be lived in. She wasn't prepared for what she saw. Red sneakers and purple shoes in the hallway, messy beside each other, clearly kicked off instead of neatly removed. A crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator door. A night sky full of stars, most of them not round but very certain, which Cora recognized as Nell's. A worn astronomy book lying open and face down on the coffee table, its page marked by a small hair clip, and the smell of home, not the scent of oak and leather like the presidential suite, but the smell of old coffee, children's soap, books, the smell of a place where people truly lived, instead of being displayed. Beckett appeared from the hallway in jeans, a gray pullover, shadows under his eyes, and Cora noticed the adjustment her brain made when she saw him outside the context of the office. No shirt and suit, no conference room 23, just a person, a tired person, in his own home, with his daughter's shoes still unpicked up in the hallway. They worked at the kitchen table. Beckett spread out the original documents, paper files he kept at home because he didn't trust any safe at the office, and Cora began matching them against the spreadsheet on her laptop. He made coffee and set it in front of her without asking. Black, no sugar. She took a sip without looking up, and neither of them mentioned that he knew how she drank it. And she wasn't surprised that he knew, and the fact that she wasn't surprised was, in itself, something she chose not to examine too closely. About an hour later, Cora needed a pen to make notes on the hard copies. She reached over, opened the nearest kitchen drawer, and stopped. Inside, lying between a roll of tape and several broken pencils, was a gun. A Glock, black, set neatly, barrel pointed inward, beside a small box of ammunition. Cora closed the drawer, slowly. She didn't slam it. She closed it like someone controlling every movement, because if she didn't, her hand would shake. "You should have a safety lock on that drawer," she said, her eyes fixed straight on the documents on the table. "There are children in the house." Silence settled between them. She had said, "in the house." Not in your house. In the house. As if it were her house, too. As if the red and purple shoes in the hallway and the night sky drawing on the refrigerator belonged to a space she also belonged in. Beckett looked at her. She didn't look back. No one commented. He opened another drawer, took out a pen, placed it in front of her, and they continued working in the kitchen where, on one side, there was a cup of black coffee and the smell of children's soap, and on the other, a gun lying beside broken pencils. Two worlds inside the same home, and Cora sat between both of them, without knowing which one she belonged to, or whether she was choosing without realizing it. Cora met Celeste Harrington in the 6th week, in the ground floor lobby of the Crane Holdings building, just as she stepped out of the elevator with her laptop in her bag, and her head still full of numbers from the morning. She understood at once that the woman standing near the reception desk didn't belong to this building the way employees belonged to it, but in another way, the way of someone who had been here often enough to know exactly where the cameras were, to know the security guard's name, and to know where to stand so she could see who stepped out of the elevator without looking as if she were waiting. Celeste Harrington was tall, half a head taller than Cora, even with Cora wearing shoes, with sleek black hair that took time and money to maintain, and she wore a long camel-colored wool coat that Cora estimated cost more than a full year of rent on her apartment, but she wore it with the carefully practiced carelessness of someone who wanted you to know she was rich without looking as if she were trying. Celeste looked at Cora. Her gaze moved slowly, from shoes to face, the kind of scan Cora remembered from her Prescott days, the kind of scan used by women accustomed to measuring other people by appearance and money, measuring Cora now and finding the result unimpressive. Old shoes, no makeup, ordinary handbag, hair tied back with an elastic band. "You're Cora, the new accountant." Not a question. Her voice was warm, the constructed kind of warm, not the natural kind. "I'm Celeste Harrington. Beckett and I have history." She placed the weight on the word history, with perfect precision, heavy enough for Cora to understand that history here didn't mean old friends or business partners, light enough that she could deny it if necessary. Cora said nothing. She stood still, one hand holding the strap of her bag, and waited, because she knew Celeste hadn't come here just to introduce herself. "I just wanted to meet you," Celeste said, tilting her head slightly, the way people did when they were pretending to be at ease. Beckett can be very focused when something captures his attention. That focus can feel more meaningful than it really is. Cora kept her face calm. "I'm an accountant. I audit books." "Of course." Celeste smiled, and that smile was sharper than anything she had said. People who get close to Beckett tend to change, sometimes in ways no one wants. She looked at Cora for another second, weighing whether the words had landed where she wanted them to, then drew her coat closer, turned away, and her heels struck the marble with the steady rhythm of a woman who knew she was being watched as she left. Cora didn't watch her go. She stood in the lobby for 10 more seconds, then walked out to the street, called a taxi, slid into the back seat, and called Polly. "Tell me something normal," Cora said instead of hello. Polly didn't ask why. Polly understood that when Cora said that, it meant she was somewhere abnormal and needed a rope to pull her back down to earth. "Dot ate all her broccoli tonight," Polly said, voluntarily. Nobody forced her. Nobody bribed her with ice cream. She ate it herself. Cora closed her eyes and rested her head against the car window. "Thank you. That actually helps." She hung up and sat in the taxi as it moved along South Wacker, watching the city drift past the glass, and thought about Celeste's words, not because they were true or false, but because they had settled inside her, and they had settled because Cora didn't have a clean answer to the question those words had raised without Celeste needing to say it out loud. How close was she getting to Beckett Crane? She thought about the black coffee that came without being asked for, about his face in the conference room doorway when he saw her sitting with Bea and Nell, about the kitchen drawer and the way she had said, "in the house," instead of "in your house." And both of them had heard it, and both of them had stayed silent. She had no answer. She had $43 that had become more than $43 thanks to her first week's pay. She had Dot at home eating broccoli voluntarily. She had 11 red marks on a spreadsheet, and Warren Fisk's name underlined in her notebook, and she had a man who remembered she drank black coffee and kept a gun beside broken pencils in the kitchen, and had 2 daughters who taught her about dead stars. The taxi turned onto her street. Cora paid the fare, stepped out, climbed 3 flights of stairs, opened the door, and Dot ran out from the hallway and wrapped herself around Cora's leg with the full body strength of a 6-year-old who had been waiting all day. Cora lifted Dot into her arms. Dot's face pressed against her neck, and she stood in the doorway of the small, dark apartment and thought, "This is normal. This is real. This is what I know. And everything else, Celeste, the drawer, history, focus, could wait until Dot was asleep." Cora didn't notice the third place setting the first time. The first time she had dinner at the penthouse was at the end of week 6, when their Saturday afternoon work session ran late, and Nell announced, "We're eating pasta," in a voice that allowed no argument, and Cora stayed because refusing a 7-year-old over pasta somehow felt more complicated than any spreadsheet she had ever handled. She sat down at the table, Nell on her left, Bea across from her, Beckett standing in the kitchen adding sauce, and she didn't count the plates because it never occurred to her to count. The second time was the following Tuesday, week 7. Cora arrived at the penthouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to review the new batch of documents Beckett had brought back from the bank safe, and as she passed the dining table on her way into the kitchen, she looked down and saw 3 place settings, 3 white plates, 3 sets of silverware, 3 water glasses, neatly arranged on the oak tabletop. Bea and Nell were still at school, not home yet. Beckett was in his study on a phone call. There was no one else in the house besides Cora, and the 3 place settings had already been there before she arrived. She looked at the third plate, at the seat where she had sat the week before, and understood that someone had set it there that morning before leaving for school, without knowing whether Cora would come that day or not. She asked Beckett about it that afternoon, while they were comparing figures. "Who sets the table?" "Bea. Bea always sets the table." He said it like an incidental fact, but Cora saw his hand pause on the page for 1 second. 3 place settings, Cora said. Every night, even when I'm not here. Beckett went quiet. Then he said, his voice softer than usual. I asked her last week. Who are you setting that for? What did she say? Dad knows. Cora looked down at the spreadsheet. She needed to look down, because if she kept looking at Beckett right then, he would see something she wasn't ready for anyone to see. B, 7 years old, with eyes like the mother she didn't remember, had set 3 places at the dinner table every night without explaining, without asking anyone, without waiting for confirmation. The 3rd plate was there like a quiet truth the child had decided on her own, and when her father asked who it was for, she answered by not answering, because the answer was too obvious to need saying aloud. The second moment happened 3 days later, on Friday night of the same week. Cora was sitting on the sofa in the penthouse living room at 10 o'clock at night, laptop on her lap, comparing 2 sets of Lakeshore development records she had finally obtained after Beckett directly ordered Warren to hand them over. B and Nell had gone to bed at 9. Beckett was in his study. The house was quiet in the way. Only a house with children could be quiet. The kind of quiet that held soft breathing from the bedrooms and the faint smell of strawberry toothpaste still lingering in the hallway. Cora heard small footsteps on the hardwood before she saw Nell. The little girl came out of the bedroom hall, eyes half closed, hair loose, carrying her pillow. The pillow with the star-patterned cover Cora had seen on Nell's bed when she passed the child's room once before. Nell said nothing. She walked to the sofa, placed the pillow beside Cora, close against her hip, then turned around and went back to bed. The whole thing took about 15 seconds. No explanation, no looking up, just an action, clean and complete, like a sentence that had been fully thought through before it was spoken. Cora looked at the star-covered pillow lying beside her and didn't touch it, just sat there with the laptop on her lap and a 7-year-old child's pillow pressed against her side, and she didn't cry because she didn't cry in places that weren't her home, but she had to press 2 fingers hard against the bridge of her nose for 10 seconds. The next morning, when Nell woke up and came into the kitchen to eat cereal, Cora asked, Nell, why did you bring your pillow out last night? Nell chewed her cereal, thought for 3 seconds with the seriousness of someone processing an important question. So if you were tired, you wouldn't have to go home. The answer was simple, direct, completely Nell, without decoration, without further explanation, just the truth of a child who had seen an adult tired on the sofa every night and decided the solution was to make sure that adult had a pillow if she needed to stay over. Cora didn't answer right away. She took a sip of coffee, swallowed something that wasn't coffee, then said, Thank you, Nell. Nell nodded, returned to her cereal, and from her point of view, the conversation ended there because she had said what needed to be said. Beckett was standing in the kitchen doorway. Cora didn't know how long he had been there, but after Nell left, he looked at Cora and said, Nell asks everyone the same thing. Nannies, tutors, anyone who stays longer than 2 weeks. He paused. No one has ever answered Nell the way you just did. How did I answer? Honestly. He said that one word, then turned away to pour coffee for himself, and Cora sat at the kitchen table with the warm mug in her hands and thought that one word shouldn't be able to carry this much weight. But it did, because it came from the man with a gun beside broken pencils, and 2 daughters who set a plate for someone who hadn't arrived yet, and brought a pillow for someone who might not stay. Cora left the penthouse at noon. The elevator closed. She stood alone inside the small steel box, exactly like that first night at the Kensington Grand, leaning her back against the wall, looking at her reflection in the muted metal surface, and she thought it clearly, without flinching, without wrapping it in reasons or logic. You've fallen in love with those 2 children, and you're about to fall in love with their father. She stood with that thought for 31 floors down to the ground. She didn't push it away. She didn't call Polly. She just stood there and let it rest in her chest, heavy and warm and terrifying. And when the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, she stepped out into the cold Chicago air and thought that caution had kept her alive during her time in hiding. But caution didn't have a star-patterned pillow, and caution didn't set a 3rd plate on the table, and caution didn't say, Dad knows, with the eyes of a mother who was gone. That night happened at the end of week 7, on a Thursday evening when Cora stayed at the penthouse later than usual, because Bea and Nell insisted that she watch a documentary about Mars with them, and when the film ended, Nell had fallen asleep on the sofa, while Bea read for another 10 minutes, then took herself to her room without anyone needing to remind her, closing the door softly with the self-discipline of a child used to taking care of herself. The penthouse was quiet. Beckett poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of Cora at the kitchen table, and sat down across from her. Cora was about to open her laptop and keep working when he looked toward the bookshelf in the living room, where there was a small photograph Cora had seen many times but had never asked about. A photo of a young woman with dark brown hair, smiling as she held one of the girls when they were very small, while the other clung to her leg. "Lenore," Beckett said. He didn't look at Cora. He looked at the photograph from across the room, the way a man looks at a picture he has looked at thousands of times and still hasn't gotten used to. "My wife." Cora stayed silent. She didn't ask. She had learned that with Beckett, silence was how you invited him to go on, while questions were how you made him close down. "Car accident," he said. Then he stopped. Those 2 words hung in the kitchen air, and the way he paused after them told Cora they weren't the end of a sentence, but the beginning of something he rarely said. "That's what I tell B and Nell. That's what's on the death certificate. That's what everyone believes." He looked down at his glass of water. "That's the only lie I've accepted living with." Cora didn't need him to say more to understand. She had lived in a world where accident was the word people used when the truth was too dangerous or too ugly to speak aloud, where a car hit a divider at 2 o'clock in the morning on an empty stretch of road, and no one asked questions, because questions came with a price. Lenore had been killed, and Beckett knew, and he had buried that truth beneath the 2 words car accident, so his daughters could grow up without having to carry it on their backs. 1 year later, he continued, his voice still even, though Cora could hear something beneath it, something held under very tight control. Nell had a cardiac event, 4 years old, 6 weeks in New York Presbyterian Children's Hospital. He stopped again. "I lost my wife. 1 year later, I almost lost my child. I sat alone in a hospital waiting room because there was no one left to call at 3 in the morning. And I thought if Nell didn't make it, I didn't know what I'd become." He looked up. "Nell made it. Nell is healthy. But the hospital team, the nurses, the doctors, the children's playroom," he stopped. "That's why I created the Pediatric Foundation. Not because of charity, because I owe them something I can't repay with money." Cora sat still with the glass of water in front of her and listened to the weight of what Beckett had just said settle between them, losing his wife and then almost losing his child within 1 year. Sitting alone in a hospital waiting room at 3 o'clock in the morning, that was a kind of loneliness outsiders couldn't imagine. The loneliness of a man who had enough money to buy everything except the one thing he needed. She looked at him and thought that this was more than he usually allowed anyone to see, and she understood, with the instinct of someone who had also hidden the truth for too long, that he was handing her a part of himself he didn't hand to other people. So she decided to hand something back. "My real name is Cora Ellsworth," she said. Beckett didn't move, but she saw his eyes change. Narrow, focus, the way he looked when he was truly listening. "I worked at Prescott & Associates for 2 years. Forensic accounting. I'm good at reading numbers. You were right. And I read something I shouldn't have read." She drew a breath. "I brought what I found to my boss, Hugh Prescott. He told me not to look into it. I didn't listen. 3 months later, my brother died in a car accident." She stopped. Car accident. The same 2 words, with the same weight, and both of them knew what they meant. "Dot's mother had already left before my brother died. I took Dot in, changed to my mother's last name, moved, and disappeared. 4 months ago, I was mopping the floors in your hotel." Beckett was silent for a long time. Then he said slowly, "Prescott & Associates, who was their biggest client?" Cora looked at him. "I never knew the name. Everything moved through shell companies." "I know the name," Beckett said, and when he said that name, Cora felt the kitchen floor shift beneath her feet. Harrington. Prescott & Associates had been laundering money for the Harrington family, the family Celeste belonged to, and Warren Fisk, Beckett's chief financial officer, the man who had delayed documents, pushed her onto a side project, built walls around Lakeshore Development, was funneling money out of Crane Holdings through Prescott & Associates and into Harrington. Cora sat at the kitchen table and saw the whole picture for the first time, from both sides. At Prescott, she had seen money coming in from an unclear source. At Crane, she was now seeing money going out toward a destination that didn't exist. The same pipeline, the same system. She had looked at it from the other side 3 years ago and almost died for it, and now she was looking at it from this side, sitting in the kitchen of the man whose money was being stolen, drinking the coffee he had made, with his daughter's pillow still lying on the living room sofa, She was the missing piece. The piece neither Beckett nor Harrington knew they needed. The piece that connected the two halves of the picture into one whole. And now she was sitting at the kitchen table, holding that piece in her hands, with no idea whether putting it down would save her or kill her. Warren Fisk acted in week 8, and he acted because he was afraid. Cora knew that because she had seen this kind of fear before in Hugh Prescott, the fear of a man standing on the lid of a hole he had dug himself and hearing the first crack. Warren didn't know exactly how much Cora had found, but he knew she had requested the Lakeshore Development records 3 times. Knew she had looked up Ridgeline Construction in the business registry, and knew she had sat alone on the 38th floor until 7 o'clock at night, with 3 spreadsheets open side by side that he couldn't see, because she locked her screen every time she left her desk. Enough to make him panic. Not enough for him to know how badly he should panic. So he did what men like him always did when they couldn't control the situation. He called someone with more power. Celeste Harrington met Cora for the 2nd time on a Wednesday afternoon at a restaurant on West Randolph Street, where Cora was eating lunch alone with a sandwich she had bought from the counter next door because she still hadn't gotten used to eating lunch in restaurants when a $4 sandwich still served its purpose. Celeste walked in as if she had a reservation, but Cora knew this wasn't coincidence, because Celeste Harrington didn't do coincidence. Celeste Harrington arranged things, and the fact that she appeared at the right restaurant, at the right hour, at the exact moment Cora was sitting alone, meant someone inside the Crane Holdings building was watching her schedule and reporting back. Celeste sat down across from her without asking, set her handbag on the table with the precision of someone who considered every surface hers, and looked at Cora with the smile Cora now knew well, warm on the outside but forged like a weapon. "The last time we talked," Celeste said, "I was gentle. I thought you'd understand what I meant." Cora took a bite of her sandwich, not hurried, not trembling. "I understood. But you're still here." Celeste tilted her head. "Still sitting in his kitchen, still reading books to his daughters, still staying later than any accountant should. I'm a hard-working accountant. You're the cleaning woman with $43 in her account, playing happy family with the most dangerous man on the East Coast." Celeste was no longer smiling. "How do you think that ends for the cleaning woman?" Cora set the sandwich down, wiped her hands with a paper napkin. Slowly. Then she looked at Celeste and spoke in a voice she hadn't used since Prescott, the voice of Cora Ellsworth, the voice of a woman who read numbers and understood the story they told. "I know exactly where I am, and I know exactly whose hands are trying to pull me out, and why." Celeste's face tightened. Fast. Only half a second, but long enough for Cora to see it. Celeste wasn't used to being looked at directly. Celeste was used to being the one looking down. "Have a nice lunch," Cora said, standing up, taking her bag, and leaving the restaurant without looking back. She called Beckett from the taxi. She didn't call Polly this time. She called Beckett, and when he answered, she spoke directly, with no lead-in. "Celeste Harrington just met me. For the 2nd time. She knows how late I stay at the penthouse every night. She knows I read to Bea and Nell. Someone in your building is reporting to her." Silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence Cora had learned to read. Not shock, not evasion, but the silence of someone rearranging the chessboard in his head. "Warren," Beckett said. One word. Warren contacted Celeste. That's how she knows. "You knew Warren was betraying you?" Cora asked. "I knew someone was betraying me. I didn't know who." He paused. "Until I hired you." Cora sat in the taxi, watching the city slide past the window, and understood. Beckett hadn't hired her only because she was good at reading numbers. He had hired her because he suspected there was a leak inside, because he needed outside eyes not blurred by the internal system, eyes that had seen this exact kind of fraud before. He had known from the beginning. "I first suspected Warren 3 weeks ago, but I only just finalized the bulletproof evidence today," Cora said. Silence, heavier than the first. "You tracked him for 3 weeks and waited until you were certain." "Yes." "Why?" Cora looked through the taxi window. Michigan Avenue stretched ahead. Pedestrians, traffic, a city that didn't care about this phone call or anything happening inside the yellow cab, stopped at a red light. "Because the last time I told someone about irregular numbers," she said, and her voice didn't shake, but she had to hold the phone with both hands. "My brother died." Silence. A silence heavier than anything either of them could have said. A silence that could hold both of their car accidents. both of their losses. Both times they had buried the truth because the truth was too dangerous to live above ground. Cora heard Beckett breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said, softly, more softly than any voice she had ever heard from him, "I understand." 2 words. And she believed him, not because he was trustworthy, but because he was the only person in the world who understood the exact weight of knowing a truth that could kill you and choosing silence in order to survive. The light turned green. The taxi moved on. Cora held the phone to her ear and said nothing else, and Beckett said nothing else either, and they stayed together inside that silence for 3 streets before she said, "I'll send you the full file tonight," and hung up. Cora came to the penthouse that night with the hard drive containing the entire file in her handbag. Bea and Nell were already asleep. The house smelled of children's soap and leftover spaghetti on the stove, and Nell's star-patterned pillow was still lying on the sofa in the same place, the place where the little girl had put it for Cora weeks ago, and no one had moved it since. They sat at the kitchen table. Cora opened her laptop, opened the file, and laid everything out. 11 irregularities, 3 shell companies, the route from Crane Holdings, through Ridgeline Construction, through Prescott and Associates to Harrington, Warren Fisk as the approving signature on every transaction, his name sitting at the end of each money pipeline like a fingerprint he thought she wouldn't find. Beckett sat across from her and reviewed every file without saying a word for 45 minutes. Cora watched him read. He showed nothing, his face flat and still, but she noticed his left index finger tapping lightly against the tabletop, in a steady rhythm, the habit Bea had described to her without knowing how carefully Cora had listened, the habit he had when he was thinking about something important. When he finished the final file, he closed the laptop, pushed it gently back toward her, and said, "That's enough," in a voice unlike the business voice she was used to hearing in conference rooms, lower, more tired, the voice of a man who had just seen confirmation of something he had feared but hadn't been certain of. They sat in silence for a while. The coffee had gone cold on the table. The city glowed beyond the windows. Lenore's photograph on the bookshelf looked into the empty living room with a smile that never changed. "I should go," Cora said, and she stood, pulling her handbag onto her shoulder, because it was already past midnight, and Polly was watching Dot, and Cora didn't want to take advantage of Polly's kindness any more than she already had, and because she needed to leave this kitchen before the closeness of the night. The truth just laid bare, the file just opened, the silence just shared, made her do something she couldn't take back. She was walking toward the door when Beckett said her name, Cora. It wasn't a voice calling her back. It wasn't an order. It was the voice of a man saying one word he had weighed for a very long time before letting it leave his mouth. And now it was there, suspended in the air between the kitchen table and the front door, and both of them could hear its weight. She turned around. He was standing. She hadn't heard him rise, and he stood about 1.5 meters from her, his hands at his sides, touching nothing, not stepping closer, just standing there with the face she had seen in the doorway of conference room 23 in week 4. The face of someone looking at something he was afraid he wanted. Only this time, he didn't hide it. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I haven't done this in years. I'm not spontaneous. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say." Cora stood by the door, her hand still gripping the strap of her handbag, and she thought she should leave, thought she should say, "We're professionals," or "The contract ends in 3 weeks," or any of the sentences the cautious part of her had practiced through 30 months of running. But she didn't say any of them. She set her handbag down on the floor, stepped toward him, and stopped 1 step away. "Then don't say it," she said. He kissed her, or she kissed him, or both of them did at the same time. She couldn't tell where the line was, because it happened so quietly it almost made no sound. Not the kind of kiss she had seen in movies. No music, no rain, no one pulling anyone back by the collar, just 2 people who were tired and afraid and had carried something alone for too long, finally setting it down in the same place. The kiss was careful, slow, not careful in the way of holding back, but careful in the way of people who knew this moment mattered and wanted to move through it the right way. When they parted, Cora rested her forehead against his jaw and felt him exhale, long and slow, the breath of a man who had just put down something he had been carrying in his hands for so long that he hadn't realized how heavy it was until he let it go. "I'm scared," she said, eyes closed, her forehead still against his jaw, and she said it because it was true, and because he had given her truth tonight, and she owed him the same. "Scared of what?" Scared we'll do this, and both of us will lose something that can't be repaired. She opened her eyes. I'm scared of becoming something B and Nell lose too. He didn't step back. His hand was at her back, not gripping, only holding, the way you hold something fragile when you know you could break it. I'm scared of that too, he said. I've been scared for weeks. It doesn't make me want this any less. Cora stood in his arms for 5 more seconds. Then she stepped back, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the laptop again. Because the 7th file in the financial report still had a summary error on the last line, and it needed to be corrected before she sent it to Odette in the morning. Beckett looked at her for a second. Then he sat down across from her, opened the paper file, took a pen, and they worked for another hour in the kitchen, where the gun still lay in the drawer, and the star-patterned pillow still lay on the sofa, and Lenore's photograph still smiled from the bookshelf. Neither of them mentioned the kiss. Neither of them pretended it hadn't happened. Everything was exactly the same as every evening they had ever spent at this kitchen table. And everything, from the way he handed her the pen, to the way she drank the cold coffee without making a face, to the way the silence between them carried a new rhythm of breath it hadn't had before, was completely different. The gala took place at the end of week 11, on a Saturday night in November, on the rooftop of Beckett's penthouse in the Gold Coast, and Cora had spent 3 weeks turning that rooftop from an open space overlooking the Chicago skyline into something 350 people would remember. She hadn't planned on becoming the event organizer, but when Beckett discovered she had organized events at Prescott before and asked whether she could take charge, she said yes because she didn't know how to say no to work she knew she would do well. Amber light covered the entire rooftop, warm but not dim, the kind of light that made people's faces look like the best version of themselves. The Chicago skyline formed the backdrop behind the stage, and the retractable glass roof Beckett had installed 2 years earlier covered the space overhead, enough to block the November wind, while still letting the city lights slip through along the edges. Bee stood at the entrance in the navy dress Cora had helped her choose the afternoon before, holding a stack of programs, and pinned to her chest was the laminated badge Cora had printed for her. B. Crane, Program Director. Bee had looked at the badge for exactly 30 seconds before pinning it on, looking at it the way she looked at everything, carefully, completely, as if she were reading not only the words on the badge but the meaning behind the fact that someone had thought to print her a badge with her name on it. Nell sat on a small chair Knox had found somewhere and placed near the entrance, and she sat there observing the arriving guests with the sharp attention of someone gathering data she didn't yet know how she would use. The evening unfolded seamlessly. As the rooftop filled with guests, Cora glided through the crowd with quiet authority, orchestrating the chaos before any issue could breathe. With sharp eyes, she seamlessly adjusted the seating, locked in the high-stakes auction sequence, and balanced the room's energy like a master conductor. When the room finally fell quiet for the opening presentations, a 13-year-old girl named Sadie stepped onto the stage. Wearing a silver sequin top she had chosen herself, her hair tied high, she stood before the microphone with the initial tremble of someone facing a massive crowd, but she did not step back. Sadie spoke with striking clarity about her heart surgery years prior, about waking up in a cold recovery room, not understanding the pain in her chest, and about the hospital playroom that changed everything for her, a place with a low drawing table, a box of crayons, and a nurse who remembered her name every single morning. That playroom didn't cure my heart, Sadie said into the microphone, her voice echoing across the silent rooftop, but it made the hospital stop feeling like the worst place in the world. The room was completely captivated, caught in the kind of shared silence that happens when hundreds of people stop thinking about themselves all at once. After Sadie, Beckett stepped onto the stage. Cora had seen him speak before, in meetings, on calls, with the precisely controlled voice of a man who used words like tools. Tonight, he stood at the microphone in a black suit and spoke about Nell. 4 years old, 6 weeks in the hospital, alone in the waiting room at 3 o'clock in the morning, and how the reason he created this foundation wasn't charity but debt. He spoke about the foundation, about the hospital, about children. He didn't mention Cora, not one word, and she knew that was deliberate, not because he didn't want to, but because in his world, mentioning her in front of 350 people would place her in the line of sight, and he didn't do that. He protected her by not saying her name, and Cora understood that, and that understanding hurt in a strange way because it was proof of what he felt without needing to speak it aloud. $2,800,000. The amount appeared on the electronic counter when the auction ended, surpassing the goal of 2,300,000. Cora looked at the number and thought of Sadie in her sequin top, and of Nell at 4 years old in the hospital, and of every child somewhere whom this money would help by keeping a playroom from disappearing. At the same time as the auction, at the back of the rooftop, something else was happening that most of the 350 guests didn't notice. Warren Fisk stood at the bar, ordering a drink, and his credit card was declined. He tried a second card. Declined. He looked up, and his eyes met Odette Shaw's from 10 steps away, a champagne glass in her hand. And Odette lifted the glass slightly toward him, a small gesture, almost polite, like congratulations. But Warren looked at her and understood. Financial access cut off, accounts frozen, escape routes blocked. No one shouted. No one was dragged outside. There was only the cold precision of a system turning its back on the man who had betrayed it, and Odette raising her champagne glass like the final period at the end of a sentence. Warren left the event 10 minutes later. No one noticed. Bea and Nell didn't witness it. Nell had been asleep on the living room sofa, her star-patterned pillow tucked beneath her head. Nearby, Bea remained at a side table sitting quietly with Sadie. Having been deeply moved by the older girl's speech, Bea was conversing with her with the distinct seriousness of miniature adults, discussing hospitals, sharing thoughts on books, and debating what the quietest hours of the night felt like. As the guest presence finally began to thin, Bea left the table and found Cora at the kitchen counter, where she was writing post-event notes. The little girl climbed onto the chair across from her, placed her hands on the table, and looked at Cora with eyes in which Cora had stopped trying not to see Lenore. Dad taps his left finger against his thigh when he's thinking about something important, Bea said. Dad did that all week. But tonight, when Dad went on stage, she stopped, choosing the word with inherited care. Dad stopped tapping. Cora looked at her. Dad only stops when he's already decided, Bea said, and those 7-year-old eyes looked at Cora with an understanding that shouldn't have existed at that age, but did exist, because she was the daughter of Beckett Crane and Lenore, and she had learned to read her father before she knew how to read letters. Dad has decided. Bea didn't say what her father had decided. She didn't need to. They both knew. At 10:45, the last guest left the rooftop. The service team cleaned up quietly, clearing tables, stacking chairs, rolling up linens, with the efficiency of people who did this every night and needed no direction. Cora sat at the kitchen table inside, the binder open in front of her, writing post-event notes in blue ballpoint pen with the small, tight handwriting she used when her mind was processing faster than her hand could move. 2,800,000. Confirm equipment pickup schedule with the sound team on Monday. Call the florist to confirm cleanup tomorrow morning before 8 o'clock. She wrote because writing kept her grounded, kept her inside the work part of tonight, instead of the other part. The part where Bea had just said, Dad has decided, and Cora still didn't know what to do with that sentence. Beckett stood at the edge of the rooftop, alone, looking out over the city. The empty stage stood behind him. The amber lights still on because no one had turned them off yet, and that light spread a warmth across his back that the cold Chicago night didn't offer. He stepped onto the stage, and Cora didn't look up because she was writing, but she heard him switch on the mic through the small click that echoed from the monitor speaker in the corner of the kitchen, the small speaker the sound team hadn't turned off. He didn't know the mic was still live. He stood on the empty stage, looking out at the city, and said, in a low voice, the voice of a man speaking to himself or to the air or to someone he didn't know was listening, I stopped counting the days on the contract in week 3. I started counting the days you were here. Cora stopped writing. The ballpoint pen came down on the binder, softly, and she sat in the kitchen listening to his voice through the small monitor speaker, and didn't breathe for 3 seconds. He said something else she couldn't quite hear because his voice was too low. And then the mic went off. Click. And silence. The next morning, while Cora was at the kitchen table checking the cleanup list, Odette came to stand beside her, poured herself coffee, and said without looking at Cora, her eyes fixed straight on the filling cup, the mic wasn't off last night. The backstage system was still running. I heard. Cora didn't move. I turned it off, Odette said, because that wasn't anyone else's business. Then Odette took her coffee, walked out of the kitchen, and didn't look back, and Cora understood that this was Odette Shaw's way of saying, I accept you, without ever having to use those words. That evening, the penthouse was quiet again. The cleanup crew had come and gone. The rooftop was empty. The tables and chairs disappeared, The amber lights turned off, leaving only the Chicago skyline doing what it always did, bright and indifferent and enormous. Nell lay on the sofa, the star-patterned pillow under her head, asleep since 9 o'clock. Bea was in her room, the door closed. Cora sat at the kitchen table, finishing the final notes, and Beckett sat across from her, elbows on the table, silent in a way she had grown used to now, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. From the sofa, Nell's voice drifted over, small, half asleep. Cora. Cora turned around. Nell opened her eyes just enough and looked at her through the blurry gaze of someone halfway between waking and sleep. "I'm here," Cora said. "The pillow is still out on the sofa," Nell said. Then she closed her eyes, fell asleep again. Cora turned back to the kitchen table and had to sit still for 10 seconds before she trusted her voice to be steady. Beckett was looking at her, saying nothing, waiting. Cora opened her handbag and took out a pair of shoes. Dot's old shoes, the toes split at the seams, the soles worn thin, the shoe glue peeling at the heel for the third time, a painful keepsake Cora had saved from her very first week, long before her new salary allowed her to buy Dot a dozen brand new pairs. She set the shoes on the kitchen table, between the laptop and the binder, between the two of them. No explanation, just placed them there. "This was the exact reason I accepted the contract," she said. "Not because of you, not because of the penthouse or black coffee or anything else. Because these shoes needed replacing and I didn't have enough money." Beckett looked at the small shoes on his granite kitchen table, the cheapest shoes that had ever rested on that surface, and he stayed silent long enough for Cora to hear Nell breathing evenly on the sofa. "I know," he said. "I know you didn't come here because of me. You came here because of yourself, because you decided these shoes mattered more than your safety." He looked at her. "That's the only thing that makes me trust you. Silence. The kind of silence both of them knew now, the kind that had its own breathing rhythm. Find a way together?" he asked. Cora looked at him. Then she rose from the chair, walked around the kitchen table, and sat down on the floor. Her back leaned against the kitchen cabinets, in exactly the same position where she used to sit when she called Polly at midnight in her Chicago apartment. Her safest position, the lowest one, closest to the ground, the place she went when she needed to feel that the ground was still there. She looked up at him. "Sit down here with me." Beckett looked at her on the kitchen floor, looked at the floor. The man who owned this penthouse, owned this building, owned an empire people named in lowered voices, had never sat on his own floor. He walked around the table and sat down beside her, his back against the cabinets, shoulder touching shoulder, cold stone beneath them, the city glowing beyond the windows, Nell breathing steadily on the sofa, Dot's little shoes resting on the kitchen table above their heads. "Find a way," Cora said. "Together." Cora headed back to her apartment that Sunday and spent 2 days sitting at the kitchen table in her small apartment, putting everything in order. Not the books, not the spreadsheets, the evidence. 2 years at Prescott and Associates, plus 11 weeks at Crane Holdings, 2 sets of data from 2 sides of the same pipeline, and when she placed them side by side on her laptop screen at 11 o'clock Monday night, while Dot slept in the next room, the picture was so complete it didn't need her to explain it. It only needed someone who knew how to read numbers to look at it and see. Money from Crane Holdings flowed through Ridgeline Construction, through Prescott and Associates, and into the Harrington family. Warren Fisk signed at one end, Hugh Prescott laundered it in the middle, Harrington received it at the other end, and her brother had died because she had seen that middle section 3 years earlier. On Tuesday morning, Cora called the attorney Polly had recommended, a woman named Deirdre Wynn, who specialized in financial whistleblower cases, and spent 3 hours in a small office on West Jackson Street, laying everything out. When Deirdre finished listening, she looked at the file, looked at Cora, and said, "You know this is enough for the FBI to open a federal investigation?" Cora knew. That was why she was there. She wasn't going to the FBI to take revenge on Hugh Prescott. She wasn't going because she was angry or because she wanted someone to pay, though there were people who should pay. She was going because Cora Ellsworth was her real name, and for the past 3 years she had lived under her mother's last name, mopped hotel floors, hidden her degree, hidden her past, hidden herself, because telling the truth had almost killed her the first time, and she hadn't been brave enough to try a second. Now she was. She didn't need a court to punish Hugh Prescott. She needed the world to know that Cora Ellsworth was real, that she had seen correctly, that the numbers she had read 3 years ago hadn't been wrong, and that she hadn't disappeared because she was weak, but because she wanted to live. Deirdre filed with the FBI that week. Hugh Prescott was placed under investigation before Christmas. Cora didn't follow the news about the case. She didn't need to. She had set the truth down exactly where it needed to rest, and the rest was no longer hers to carry. The evening she received confirmation from Deirdre that the FBI had accepted the file, she called Beckett. He answered after 2 rings, and she could hear B in the background explaining to someone, probably Nell, about Jupiter's orbit. "I stopped hiding," Cora said. A short silence. Then Beckett's voice came through, and in that voice was something she had been waiting a long time to hear without knowing she was waiting for it. Not the almost smile, not the controlled smile, but the real one, the kind that changed the shape of an entire sentence. "Not hiding suits you better." 2 weeks later, Odette Shaw called Cora into conference room 23, closed the door, sat down across from her with a cup of black coffee that Cora now knew was Odette's, because Odette also drank it black with no sugar, and said, "You found Warren in 3 weeks. The person before you had 2 years and didn't find him." Odette took a sip of coffee. "I recommended to Mr. Crane that you be promoted to head of internal audit." He agreed. "But I want you to know the recommendation was mine." She looked at Cora with the eyes that had been assessing her since the first day, and had finally seen enough. "This isn't a favor. This is reality." Cora looked at Odette and thought about the first day she had stepped onto the 38th floor in a $3 Target shirt and shoes polished over peeling leather, and Odette had said, "I'll see for myself." Odette had seen, and Odette, who gave no one anything they hadn't earned, had seen enough. Cora nodded. "Thank you." Odette stood. "Don't thank me. Work." Then she walked out, and Cora sat alone in conference room 23, where she had first met Bea and Nell, where Dot's snow globe still sat on the table, and she thought that her name was Cora Ellsworth, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to hide it. In June, 6 months after the gala night, Cora moved to a sunnier neighborhood in Chicago with Dot, not into Beckett's penthouse. Into her own apartment, on the 3rd floor, on a street with a bakery on the corner, and a little coffee shop 2 blocks away that Cora liked, because the morning light fell onto the table by the window just right. Her apartment, her rent, her life, connected to his life but not swallowed by it, because Cora had learned that loving someone didn't mean disappearing into them. It meant standing beside each other close enough for shoulders to touch, but steady enough for each person to remain on their own feet. Dot met Bea and Nell on a Saturday afternoon in Millennium Park. Cora had thought about that moment for weeks, wondering whether the 3 children would get along, whether the difference in age and temperament would create distance, but she had worried for nothing. Bea looked at Dot for exactly 5 seconds, and then asked, "Do you know about white dwarfs?" And Dot said, "No," and Bea said, "Good, I'll tell you. It's very interesting," and that was the end of it. Bea lectured Dot on astronomy for 40 minutes, while Dot listened with wide, perfectly attentive eyes, then fell asleep halfway through, because Dot was still Dot, and Dot fell asleep in the middle of almost everything. Nell looked at Dot slumped asleep on the park bench with the expression of someone who had just discovered a new scientific phenomenon. "She just sleeps," Nell said, "in the middle of dinner." "In the middle of most things," Cora confirmed. Nell looked at Dot for 3 more seconds, then nodded, accepted it, and turned to ask Dot when she woke up whether she wanted to see Nell's rock collection at home, and Dot said yes before her eyes were fully open. And Cora looked at the 3 children and thought that family wasn't always something you were born into. Sometimes it was something you built with your hands, with dinners where a 3rd plate sat on the table, and a pillow brought out to the sofa, and a snow globe slipped into a coat pocket, so you won't be lonely. One weekend in June, Cora visited the downtown area, not for work. She went to the Kensington Grand Hotel, walked through the white marble lobby that she now saw differently, not with the eyes of a janitor, but with the eyes of someone who had once belonged to this place in a way no one had seen. She didn't go up to the 31st floor. She didn't go to the presidential suite, didn't stand before the door with the brass plaque engraved with those 2 words. She went down. The basement, the employee changing room, cold white fluorescent lights, a concrete floor, rows of gray metal lockers lining the walls, the white plastic chair where she had sat for so many nights before and after shifts, with worn shoes and a cup of machine coffee in her hand. Locker number 14, her locker. She opened it, still empty, still unused by anyone else, as if this place had kept her spot for her even after she left. From her handbag, She took out the snow globe, the old one, the $5 one bought on Michigan Avenue, the Chicago skyline inside, the fake snow that shook up and then settled in clumps. Dot had a new one now, a bigger one bought in New York, with the Chicago skyline inside and prettier falling snow, and the old one had completed its mission. Cora placed the snow globe inside locker number 14, closed it. Why? She turned around. Beckett stood in the doorway of the changing room, out of place among the metal lockers and plastic chairs and fluorescent lights, a black suit in the middle of concrete, out of place in the way of a man who owned the building but had never come down to the basement, had never seen the place where his employees changed shoes and drank machine coffee and sat for 15 minutes before a shift, because those were the only 15 minutes of the day when they didn't have to stand. This is where I changed into my janitor shoes every night, Cora said. This is where I sat before shifts and after shifts. This is where I stared at my phone and calculated how much $43 could cover when divided by life. She looked at the locker. This is where I started, and I wanted to leave something here. So if someone opens this locker one day, they'll know someone went from here, from worn shoes and night shifts and machine coffee, to somewhere better. Beckett looked around the basement, truly looked, not glancing, but looking closely, at each locker, each plastic chair, each crack in the concrete floor, the unforgiving white fluorescent light falling over everything, including him. She watched him looking, and understood that he was seeing something he had never seen before. Even though he had owned this building for years, seeing the world beneath the world he lived in, where people came not because they chose to, but because they needed to, and left because they were strong enough, not because anyone saved them. You started here, he said softly. I started here. Thank you for showing me. They stood in the basement for a while longer, saying nothing, just standing among the lockers and the fluorescent lights, two people from two completely different worlds who had chosen each other, not because of magic or fairy tales or coincidence, but because each of them had made hundreds of small choices, choosing honesty over safety, choosing to stay instead of run, choosing to sit down on the kitchen floor instead of standing apart. Then they took the elevator up, left the hotel, and went back to Dot, waiting at Polly's house, and Bea and Nell waiting at the penthouse, back to the life none of them had planned but all of them showed up for, every day, imperfect, afraid, continuing. There's one thing it takes years to understand, and no one can teach it to you. You can only arrive there on your own, usually when you're too tired to keep pretending. It's this. The life you're meant to live isn't waiting for you at the end of a plan. It's in the wrong turn. It's in the night when you lie down because you can't stay on your feet another second, on a bed that isn't yours, in a room that isn't yours, and a stranger says, "Leave when you're ready," instead of calling security. Cora had spent a long time being careful with trust, with hope, with her real name. She thought being careful kept her safe. In truth, it kept her small. Not safe, only small. She had lain down on a bed that wasn't hers, and every choice after that, taking the contract because of Dot's shoes, sitting still while two children told her about dead stars, opening the kitchen drawer and closing it again and staying, telling her real name to a man with a car accident of his own, kissing him in the kitchen, and then sitting down to fix the report because the work still needed to be finished, placing the worn shoes on the granite kitchen table, sitting down on the floor and saying, "Sit down here with me," filing the evidence with the FBI and taking back her name, placing the snow globe in locker number 14. Every one of those choices, honest choices, frightening choices, costly choices, had led her here. She hadn't planned any of it. She had shown up for all of it. In the end, that was the whole story. And it was enough. This story may have touched some of you. Those who are tired, those who are afraid, those who are calculating how a paycheck can be divided by life, those who are wondering whether they deserve to be seen. The lesson Cora teaches us isn't about meeting a billionaire or being saved by someone richer. The lesson is this. Your worth doesn't live in your bank account, doesn't live in your title, doesn't live in the shoes you wear. Your worth lives in how you show up every day, for the people who need you, for the truth, for yourself. And sometimes courage isn't doing something extraordinary. Courage is stopping the running. It's saying your real name. It's sitting down on the kitchen floor and saying, "Together," when everything inside you wants to run. How did this story feel to you? Did it touch something in your real life? Was there a moment when you had to choose between safety and honesty? Between hiding and facing the truth? We truly want to listen. so please share your feelings in the comments below, from deep in your heart. Every story you tell matters, and we read them all. If this story stayed with you, please hit like so we know. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the new stories every day, because the next story may be the one that finds you at the exact moment you need it most. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.